For the Minnesota Vikings in 2023, they look to shake off all that stress, all that fast heart rate that was the 2022 season, where all those close games was really in play when they won the NFC North. But unfortunately, that came back to haunt them in their first round exit at the hands of the New York Giants, where all that close game magic just ran out. So before the season started for them, they had salary cap issues, limited draft resources, but nonetheless, they used last year's offseason to fix the reason why they were in such situations, such as replacing Ed Donatel with Brian Flores as defensive coordinator, and then they went on to add the likes of corner Byron Murphy and an edge rusher's Marcus Davenport. So they did all of this in hopes of trying to make a deeper playoff run with a better defense on paper in the NFC playoffs, especially when there was more pressure than ever to get it done with Kirk Cousins at quarterback, who was entering the final year of his contract, and there were questions about whether the Vikings wanted to keep him around and give him a new deal after the season was over. So when you look at the Minnesota Vikings, things didn't get off to a good start for them. They actually had an inverse of how 2022 was going, losing all their close games instead of winning them compared to how 2022 went. But when you look at how the season started for Minnesota, they started 1-4, and the main crux of it was the inability to take care of the ball on offense, whether it be from Kirk Cousins throwing turnovers or just, being careless with the ball, like not like holding it correctly, or from the likes of Alexander Madison, rookie Jordan Addison, or others also not taking care of the ball. It put them in serious deficits, or in the case of they were up big, it gave leads away. So they started at 1-4, but once they got that under control, that was when everybody started playing much better. That included Kirk Cousins, and they went from 1-4 to 3-4 before the mid-season point, and they looked like a solid wildcard contender. And that was during a point where they were missing top receiver Justin Jefferson, who actually missed a good amount of the season due to a hamstring injury. So they had a 3-game winning streak going after starting 1-4, and the Vikings were getting to a point, like I said, mid-season wildcard contender. And when you look at their mid-season, their early season turnaround as they're starting 1-4, the defense started playing much better under Brian Flores. Sure, there were still some flaws in coverage in the secondary, but Minnesota's skill players under Flores, they played a lot more differently, in a good way, of course, than when they did under Ed Donatel. The defense was more hard-hitting, more aggressive. They were heavy on blitzing, so they really wanted to hit you in the face. So two players that stood out greatly from this was Byron Murphy, the new signee, and rookie linebacker Ivan Pace Jr. So Murphy was really good in coverage in the secondary, probably the one positive in that secondary, but it was Pace in the front seven, who's like a hydra, waiting in the wings with this fast tackling awareness. So just goes to show you that, hey, a change in defensive coordinator was what the Vikings really needed. And then when you look at back of the offense, Jordan Addison's rookie year was actually good for them because, yeah, at first it was difficult for him to net targets because, well, it was such a loaded offense with Justin Jefferson and then tight end TJ Hawkinson. But considering the circumstances that I'll be talking about in just a bit, Addison still managed to have a successful first season with a near 1,000-yard season and 10 touchdowns. And he actually was pretty good performance-wise as well. But next season should be really interesting. Next season will be a good test for him, considering that Justin Jefferson will be back healthy. And then once TJ Hawkinson enters back into the lineup as well, alongside whoever else they add, it should be interesting how that offense will roll with all those weapons. Unfortunately for the Vikings, things didn't go exactly as planned after that 3-4, after they got to the point of 3-4, because when they were playing the Packers in Week 8, disaster struck for Minnesota because, yes, they were riding the high of coming off an upset win over the 49ers at home on a Monday night. They go on a short week. They were pulling away from the Packers on the road. But then in the fourth quarter, Kirk Cousins suffers the dreaded injury that nobody wants to have, the torn Achilles, early in that fourth quarter. So this was actually his first major career injury. And, well, whether you were a Vikings fan or not, you knew it was the death nail in their season from there. So, yeah, Kirk Cousins was gone for the season, and they were forced to ride the quarterback carousel from that point onwards. It started with Jaron Hall, who got injured like 2 quarters in. Then it started with a brief tenure with traded Josh Dobbs from Arizona, who went on to play a couple of games. Then once he started underperforming, starting with that Denver game, they went to Nick Mullins, and then they went back to Jaron Hall, and then they went back to Nick Mullins. Interestingly enough, the Vikings were still in playoff contention for both, not just for a spot, but also for the NFC North despite this. And eventually, though, it came to a head when they faced the Detroit and unfortunately lost the division when they played them. So eventually, at some point, all these factors were going to come to a head. They just didn't have enough to compete, especially considering not just the Cousins injury that affected them, it was injuries to other players that really made things difficult. Because, they had these problems on both sides of the ball, but then when you lose your skill players, it just makes things even tougher. Because they were out without Justin Jefferson for most of the season. He didn't come back until week 15 when their playoff hopes were on life support. And then they went on to lose TJ Hawkinson in that first Detroit game in week 16. Yeah, week 16, I believe, to a torn ACL. And now it's looking likely that he's not going to be available to start the season because, again, it's a very late season injury for the Vikings. So probably not till halfway through this next season he's going to come back, if at all. And then key defensive player Jordan Hicks suffered a leg contusion. And then Marcus Davenport at edge rusher only played 6 games due to a high ankle sprain. So when you couple this with the inconsistent play to start the year for Minnesota, the Vikings were just buried even further once the injuries to all these key players started to pile on. So overall, I expected a step down from last season for the Vikings because, that quality of play was going to go down. But I didn't predict the inconsistency in the injuries to bury them, like to 7-10. It was just rough. It was just a rough year for Minnesota. They did manage to stay in the playoff fight until the very end by just a hairline, but it just still ended up being a disappointment of a season for Minnesota, which is unfortunate. It not by too much of fault of their own. But when you look at the Vikings offseason, at least they get a bit of a chance to rebuild themselves up. They have around $41 million in cap space, which is a good amount of money to spend. And they have the 11th overall pick. Now, does that mean they can go up and get a certain positional player? Probably not. But they can go and get whatever is best fit for them. Now, unfortunately, here comes the interesting question. Because looking at some of the key free agents, they have some tough decisions to make. This team's going to look a little bit different going to 2024. And that starts at the quarterback position. Kirk Cousins. Let's talk about him a little bit after I get through this list. You also have to consider linebackers Anthony Barr and Jordan Hicks, edge rushers Marcus Davenport and Daniel Hunter, and third down receiver KJ Osborne, the third receiver. So, some interesting key free agents when you look at the Minnesota Vikings. You can't keep them all unless they agree to team-friendly deals. So, some tough decisions are going to have to be made within the next couple of weeks. They did make an interesting move, though, and that was by releasing running back Alexander Madison, who vastly underperformed in a starting role once they released Dalvin Cook last offseason, which was an interesting move in of itself. So looking at some of their needs going into the start of the new league year, I don't know if it's happened by now, but what are they going to do at quarterback? Are you going to re-sign Kirk Cousins or are you going to move on? The Vikings, they can't be making a single decision in free agency until they know what Kirk Cousins is going to do. They have to be considering, do they even want Kirk Cousins back? And yes, the injury was very unfortunate. The Achilles injury was very unfortunate. To be honest, he's played very solid for them. And maybe solid's not enough for them to keep him. But nonetheless, he has stabilized the offense to a degree. But now it's just a matter of question, like, do they believe it's time to move on? Do they believe they've reached their ceiling with them? Do the players believe that, well, do they want to keep Cousins or do they want to go in a different direction? So even so, regardless, Cousins is not going to come cheap, despite coming off an injury. So if the Vikings want him back, they're going to have to convince him to return on a team-friendly deal. So once you figure out the quarterback position, you got to address the front four. Both Marcus Davenport and Danielle Hunter, as well as DJ Wonnum, they're all free agents. And, well, the interior was very bad this past season. So Minnesota, I think you should re-sign Danielle Hunter and then figure out what to do at the defensive tackle position, sign someone new, and then find another edge rusher as well. Marcus Davenport was a big bust. Find an edge rusher in both free agency and the draft. And then you got to find a new starting running back. Replacing Dalvin Cook with Alexander Madison was a curious choice. Ended up being a big bust now. That's why Madison was released. Ty Chandler was good. Once he got the starting role, but you still have to address that position, like maybe have him compete for that starting spot again. So overall, I mean, you got to fix the running back position to help whoever's going to be at quarterback. Maybe they can do that in the draft. So overall, as I expected, it was a step down for the Minnesota Vikings in 2023, although not in the way people expected. So they have a tough quarterback decision nonetheless on its hands, and a decision that they have to make as soon as possible. Again, it hasn't been made at the time I'm talking about this, but it still has to be made before anything else. Resign Kirk Cousins or take a chance on a young gun in the draft. Decisions in Minnesota.